Welcome to Exploring Monterey Bay, airing bi-weekly on KSQD 90.7, 89.7, and 89.5 FM. I'm your host, Mathilde Rand. My guests are Maria Gitin and Marcia Hashimoto. Maria Gitin is the author of This Bright Light of Ours, Stories from the Voting Rights Fight, a memoir and oral history based on her 1965 experience as a teenage civil rights worker in violently segregated Wilcox County in Alabama. 4 decades later, she returned to gather stories from the courageous grassroots heroes she could never forget. Maria Gitin was a national fundraising consultant and diversity trainer for 28 years. She has received numerous racial justice awards in recognition of her lifetime commitment to civil rights. Maria is a frequent presenter on racial justice and voting rights. Marcia Hashimoto grew up in a Black Asian ghetto neighborhood in San Mateo. After World War II, this was the only area in San Mateo where Japanese Americans were permitted and welcome to live. She feels extremely fortunate to have had the best possible childhood, teenage and young adult experience with neighbors and classmates who respected and supported each other. Those relationships have become lifelong friendships. Marcia was married to the late Mas Hashimoto of Watsonville for 51 years. In 1960, Mas was the first person of color to be hired in the Watsonville High School district, teaching U.S. history at his alma mater for 36 years. During his retirement of 26 years, Mas was invited to speak about the unjust incarceration of the Japanese Americans during World War II. Marcia was not incarcerated during World War II, but her grandparents, parents, and 2 brothers were. Her parents always talked about those years of hardship and encouraged their children to embrace the meaning of civil and human rights for all people. Marcia has been a member of the Watsonville-Santa Cruz Japanese American Citizens League for decades and has served as president of the local chapter for 14 years. Marcia continues to be actively engaged in civil and human rights issues, participates in educational events about the unjust incarceration of the Japanese Americans during World War II, and supports cultural and outreach programs. Welcome, Maria and Marcia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
Maria, can you briefly speak about the motivations, values, and life experience that led you to find the courage to go to the South to join Dr. King's project?
Yes, and thank you so much for inviting us. And I do want to give a shout out to my friends in Wilcox County, Alabama, who are listening to this. It's because of you that I have been able to share these stories that you so generously shared with me. I had an upbringing quite different than Marcia, although we are both baby boomers, born right after World War II. And that was a time of great change and, in many ways, great hope, because we and our families had witnessed, observed, or soon learned about great injustices done during that war. I grew up in a very rural area, opposite of Marcia, miles from anyone, in Pengrove, California, in case any of my classmates are out there, in between Santa Rosa and Petaluma, chicken farming and dairy area. But we had a lot of progressive information come our way because we were so close to San Francisco. And also, my classmates included children like Marcia who were born right after the incarceration experience, so they knew that their grandparents and parents had been unjustly imprisoned, and really made an impression on me about how unfair that was. And also, I had classmates whose grandmothers had numbers on their arms because they had been in the death camps but had managed to escape. And of course, many had lost relatives in Auschwitz and the other death camps. So it was a time of political consciousness, and the baby boomers, we get called out for a lot of things, but one of the things that's true is that most of us became politically aware at an early age, and many of us stayed politically aware. Despite that, I grew up in a very white rural community where Azorians were the farm workers. But I was eager to get away from home. I did not have as happy a childhood as Marcia did, and I couldn't wait to leave. So I worked as a live-in maid and raised some money. I got a scholarship, and then I got a low-income work-study program and went to San Francisco State, where a dream come true, encountered radical professors, just like our students do today at UC Santa Cruz. I was 18 years old when yesterday was Bloody Sunday, 60 years ago. It's hard to believe, but I heard Dr. King on television asking white people to come south because that would bring media and attention and political pressure to bring about the Voting Rights Act and to stop the killing and violation of black people's civil rights. So I had always been idealistic and wanted to make a difference, and I just said, sign me up. It was a very organized program. It was after Bloody Sunday, so one of the reasons my book's done so well is the only book about that summer in the rural areas. And the training they gave us was intensive. It was like a military boot camp. It was nonviolent military boot camp. We had every famous leader you can think of, including Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, Hosea Williams, Dorothy Cotton, all the big name leaders that they're still making documentaries about. We met them in person in Atlanta. We had 14 hours a day study sessions. We had study groups. We had each one teach one, and then we had a lot of training from people who had been beaten and been in jail. We were taught how to protect our organs, and we heard about the fact that boys might be beaten and girls might be raped. So we were very full of ourselves. They pumped us full of the idea that we were the white kids coming to bring the attention and the media and maybe the federal forces that would make it safer. So our courage was somewhat borrowed from the courage of the young people that we were soon to meet. Marcia, you've done such a great job of talking about my book. I would almost rather hear you speak more at this point.
Well, thank you, Marie. What inspired me about the stories in Maria's book, This Bright Light of Ours, that at the young age of 19, Maria's civil rights journey is inspiring, truly inspiring. She's fearless and totally committed to fighting for the rights of all people. Maria's writing really speaks to her strong connection and trust with the Black community. Their fight for voting rights and validation as U.S. citizens continues to be a fight for democracy. And now, more than ever, we must stand together as our nation's freedom fighters, just as Marie and those young people did way back in 1965. So on page 270 of Maria's book, and you must get her book, it's absolute imperative that you read this wonderful book. So on page 270, Maria summarizes all that she had learned from her civil rights journey at that time. First of all, she could never ignore racism, bigotry, and bias. She developed a core belief in the ultimate goodness of people, as well as the potential for evil in all of us. She discovered that wisdom doesn't always come from schooling, but that education is the surest way out of poverty. A quote from Maria is, "I experienced the deep joy of belonging to a movement of the people," unquote. Maria concludes that the people of Wilcox County offered her love and acceptance that she never had before.
Absolutely. I think it would be hard to imagine that somebody, especially a white person, could go back somewhere where they had basically just spent a summer as a volunteer and be embraced. Like, I went back to interview people and hear their stories about 40 years later. Yeah, I first went back in 2008 and have been back several times since then. But people said that they had been so despised by the white community. And they said that being seen as a human being by someone who was college educated was this validating experience. Now, I was in a very, very rural area. I want to make this clear to anyone that this was not the urban experience at all. But what's more important is that despite how they were treated, these students and adults had been out demonstrating for 6 months had been to jail, had been arrested, had not had any kinds of protections. And they had participated, the people in Wilcox County went over to Selma, and several people who were now personal friends of mine were beaten off the bridge. And they still believed in integration, which is amazing, because certainly, as you know, within a very short period of time, there was a whole segment of the population who were saying, we're really done with white people. We do not believe in integration. But being in a community where they had the numbers but not the power empowered people. And then, of course, Dr. King came to visit often. And when he came, then the attackers would back off into the bushes. And then when he wasn't there, they would come back in and beat people up and put people off their property. So I was just so profoundly grateful that people accepted me when I was a little kid, but probably even more grateful that they accepted me so much later, when many of the external conditions had not changed that much, that there hadn't been a lot of improvement in ownership of property. Certainly it's been the biggest change that everybody reported to me, is that they don't feel afraid every time they see the sheriff anymore, because the sheriff and everybody else is black, Right. So yeah, so they have the political power.
You talked about the people you met in Wilcox County who were not well protected. Did you feel protected? Was there a system set up?
No. When we were at the training, that they told us that the purpose of having white people come down to the South, and why Dr. King particularly wanted white people to come, was that we would bring media attention. When the media was there, especially after Bloody Sunday, the local people were less likely to be violent because they didn't want to be seen that way on national television. And that we would bring financial resources, that we were all had money, which was certainly not true in my case, and that it would influence our families to pressure Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act, which was going to be the linchpin after the Civil Rights Act. It was going to be the one thing where people could finally elect their own people in these majority black counties that had not been able to vote. So as it turned out, in the rural areas, we didn't get any coverage. The media had kind of lost interest after the march to Montgomery, and the locals were as virulent as ever.
So my question was, were there a lot of white cops?
We did not knowingly put ourselves in a position to be beaten, but one of my coworkers who was black, Mike Farley, we were arrested for conspiracy to boycott, which meant we were handing out flyers on the steps of the church telling people not to shop in stores that refused to hire black people. The little white downtown was where the white people lived, and then the county was majority black. So we were handing out these flyers, and the sheriff came with guns and ordered us all into cars and took us to jail. And I was in a cell with other white girls. They segregated us in jail. And there was a white worker with us, one of the volunteers, Mike Farley, who was put in a cell with a mentally ill black man. And that black man was told to beat Mike. So he was beaten while we were in the next cell, yelling and banging on the bars and trying to get him to stop. So we did not do demonstrations. That was one thing that Dr. King told us. The time for marching is through. This is about focusing on getting the vote. We've demonstrated, we've gone to jail, we've been beaten. Avoid being beaten. But Mike was beaten, and then also a young black man, Don Green, they planted moonshine in his car and then dragged him out of his car and beat him up also while I was there. And there were more beatings, mostly of black kids.
Let me take a brief pause and let the listeners know that this is KSQD 90.7, 89.7, and 89.5 FM, and of course online at ksqd.org. I'm here with Maria Gitin and Marcia Hashimoto, and the topic of conversation is gaining courage by the acts of leaders. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Well, I would like to mention to Marcia, we were talking about it earlier, how the courage that the Japanese American community had to stand up and demand reparations. The elders often didn't want to talk about such things, but the younger generation, the baby boomers understood that the importance of reparations, and it took a lot of courage to bring up those kinds of stories. And Marcia and Moss, with the help of historian Jeffrey Dunn, put on a reenactment ceremony. I don't remember what year was that, Marcia?
That was around 2002.
2002.
And it was Sandy Leyden that was key.
It was Sandy
Leyden.
Okay,
yes.
Sandy Leyden. It was one of the most powerful experiences I've had, but a lot of people had the courage to reenact, to relive the trauma that they had been through. And I think seeing people stand up for what they believe in is something that we really need at this moment in history. Don't you agree, Marcia?
Well, thank you, Maria. If I may start a little bit from the beginning of things, that my connection with the civil rights and human rights movement really begins with the unjust incarceration of my parents, my grandparents, and my brothers in America's concentration camps. And yes, we do call it America's concentration camps. They are not the death camps.
No.
And so we have permission from our Jewish friends to call America's camps America's concentration camps. So my parents and my family's imprisonment, along with 120,000 Japanese Americans living in the West Coast, was ordered by President Franklin Roosevelt, signing Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, during World War II. And this date is known as the Day of Remembrance. Without due process, our constitutional rights ceased to exist, and only churches and friends stood up for us. And the Quakers were the only organization that supported us. Not even the ACLU came to our defense. Years later, young Japanese American lawyers, senators, and congressmen fought and gained redress and reparations for the incarcerees who were still alive in the 1980s. At this time, many people were reluctant to share their historical experience of being in camp. Some people felt that, when you're in prison like that, it's because you've done something wrong. And so you don't want to express to your children or your grandchildren that you were in a camp that was like a prison, because then they'd wonder, well, what did you do wrong? It was a moment that brought a lot of sadness. But it was concluded after the redress and reparations movement, it was concluded that racism, wartime hysteria, and the failure of our political leaders were the cause of the unjust imprisonment of innocent Japanese Americans, and 2/3 were American citizens. So most families, as I said, were very reluctant and never talked about their incarceration in the desolate camps. But my parents always shared how they endured the hardships of those years and continually impressed upon their 4 children that we are Americans with all the rights as Americans. And they emphasized the importance of standing up for our rights and to protect the rights of others. So their lessons are nearly identical to Maria's friends, what they expressed in her book. For instance, on page 249 of Maria's book, Lewis Baldwin recalled Dr. King's talk in 1965 on continuing the work on voter registration in spite of unrelenting attacks on registrants and demonstrators. Quote, this is from Lewis Baldwin, a quote, "Don't let anybody make you feel that you don't count. You may not have the opportunities that many other people have, but you are as good as any white person in Wilcox County. You are somebody, and you matter in this world." And that's exactly what my parents repeated after every lesson and every story that they told my brothers and my sister and myself about their experiences in the camps during World War II. Another example, in Maria's book on page 254, it was said that teachers at black colleges tried to inspire their students to strive to escape grinding poverty and racism through higher education. Again, that's exactly what my parents stressed. They repeated the importance of a college education, which they never had. They felt education would help equalize and balance the scale of opportunity, especially for girls and minorities. I just want to conclude with Maria's quote from Louis Baldwin. This is what Louis Baldwin said, and you quoted him, Maria. Quote, Dr. King knew that it is never oppression that destroys a people, but the acceptance of oppression without protest.
That is so right.
Powerful.
Absolutely. Extremely well said. We're talking about your book, so we have a few minutes, but you can read from your book, The Bright Light of Ours.
I really want to say how grateful I am to Marcia for her friendship and for picking out some of the salient themes. But I feel right now that one of the things that made the civil rights movement powerful was the solidarity, the belief in something bigger than ourselves, so that even if we disagreed, and we disagreed a lot, like between Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we would have these bull sessions that were more like BS sessions where everybody's like, no, my wording and your wording, and fighting over dogma. But when it came time to accomplish a specific objective, we would go out together. And the other thing was the power of us doing this jointly. I myself was always kind of a fraidy cat. I know people always say I was brave, but I want to read just a short piece from the book about one of the people who really, truly inspired me, Ethel Brooks. And she was a 27 or 24-year-old single mom who had dropped out of college and come back home. But she had been trained at the same training I was trained by Dr. King, and she was considered a leader in her community. And she organized a lot of students who had participated in the January children's marches and then the youth rally in Selma, where they were all arrested. So she was neither a preacher's wife nor a teacher, and I really identified with her as an older sister or an aunt. And she was just a natural leader, and she was very outspoken. She once was quoted in the paper saying, I don't think the mayor has anything to say to Negroes except that those who go to his office to get somebody out of jail. I just want to share a story. We were driving back from her place in where she lived in the Bend area of Coy to Camden, and a Lane pickup truck, a Lane Butane, they were very active in the Klan, started chasing us. And it was a bumpy one-lane rural road with ditches on either side. And when we got to a crossroad, she pulled into the side track in the back and hid until the pickup passed us. And I said, narrow escape. And I exhaled. And then, to my horror, she pulled out behind them and started tailgating them with her window rolled down, screaming and yelling wildly. And another white worker and I were in the back seat screaming, Ethel, stop, stop. We were laughing, but at the same time, we were scared half to death. Finally, she backed off. The white men glared back at her with faces that said, crazy lady, we'll get you next time, before they roared on. She wasn't always nonviolent, but her reckless courage made me feel braver. And I think Marcia and I were talking earlier also about what we fear right now is actually a lack of courage nationally and internationally, that people are succumbing to autocrats. They are turning off or turning away from knowing what's going on because it's so awful that democracy is being destroyed. Our government is being dismantled by a couple of billionaires. And many people, including, sadly, I was reading in the New York Times, various Congress members saying that they're afraid for their families. And when I think about what my friends endured, risking their lives, and did lose their lives, some of them, and did lose their homes, and did lose their jobs, standing up for something that's right. And I believe that there will be a movement of people with various interests who have their greatest interest in getting rid of this current situation and moving forward to the elimination of poverty and racism, which we began all those years ago. And Marcia, I know you feel much the same way.
Absolutely. Maria especially, and I am to an extent, we'll go out there and we'll physically protest and we'll demonstrate because that's comfortable for us. But for some people, that is not comfortable. And that's okay. You can still write to your congressmen or senators or people of leadership and let them know how you feel, that you do not accept what is going on with our community and our people.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I hear in both of your stories and your experiences that it's similar. And I think you've mentioned that yourself. And I hope people hear that. It doesn't matter what color skin you have and what background you have. But you're telling us, listen and learn from those who came before us, who had the courage to stand up. And I really appreciate it. It really makes me more motivated myself. Now, listeners, if you want to know more about Maria's book, The Bright Light of Ours, see her website, thisbrightlightofours.com. It's one word, thisbrightlightofours, and then .com. And if people want to contact you, how may they contact you?
Also at that website, there's a pull-down tab that has contact, that has my address, phone number, and
Perfect.
email. So those are all the good ways to reach me.
If people have questions for you, Marcia,
They can call me at 831-722-6859. Just leave a message on my phone and I will return your call.
excellent.
And it's a landline,
It's-
so don't text her.
It's a landline. Don't
correct.
text.
Thank you, Marcia and Maria, for this enlightening conversation. I really enjoyed it. And listeners, this was Exploring Monterey Bay on 90.7, 89.7, and 89.5 FM. Tune in next time for another program.